Hi, welcome to episode 2 of the Case for Conservation podcast. I'm your host, Andre Mada. For this episode, I spoke to David Duthie about the links between nature and the COVID-19 pandemic. It's quite well established that COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease that passed from wild species to human beings. But some of the details are a bit less clear, and I invited David to help me to understand them better. David spent many years at different UN agencies that work on conservation. Although he's not a specialist on zoonotic disease, I invited him to speak about this topic because he's demonstrated a comprehensive understanding of every conservation topic that I've ever discussed with him. And I found that to be the case on this occasion as well. I think that's all that I need to say in terms of introduction, but just to let you know that about 3/4 of the way through the discussion, there is an audio marker to indicate that we changed the subject and returned to an earlier part of the discussion. So that's just to avoid any confusion when that pops up. David, the reason for asking you on to the podcast was to talk about a specific aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is its causes. But before getting into that, could I ask you a question which I'm planning to ask all future guests, and that is how you became involved in conservation in the first place?
Sure. I'll give you a little potted history of my life. I studied environmental biology at Oxford Polytechnic in the 1970s and did a PhD on migration of moths after that, and then became a private tutor in Oxford, but ended up teaching the daughters of a well-known environmentalist, Norman Myers. And through Norman, I got to work on some of the first biodiversity country studies in Kenya, in fact. And through working there as an environmental consultant, I eventually came onto the radar screen of the United Nations Environment Programme. We're looking for a project officer for a project called Biodiversity Planning Support Programme. And having worked on biodiversity country studies in Kenya and also in Eritrea, I was well positioned to do that post. And that got me to UNEP Nairobi in 2000. I stayed there until 2005 and then moved to the regional office for Europe in Geneva, and finally ended up in the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity Secretariat in Montreal, which is where we met.
Yeah, that's right. That was 2011.
Yep.
Right.
So in Montreal, I was working for the Japan Biodiversity Fund, which was a $50 million support project to help countries revise their national biodiversity strategies in the light of the global biodiversity strategy, which was agreed in Japan in 2010 and is expiring at the next convention of the parties meeting next year in China.
And we haven't actually mentioned that you are now officially retired from the UN. What else are you busy with?
Yes, I became a gentleman of leisure in 2016 and returned to England. And having worked at the sort of global level for a while, helping developing countries mostly to meet their obligations under the Biodiversity Convention, I've become a little bit more local now. I'm a parish councillor, but we have a strong environmental angle to the work that we do. And I've also joined what's called the University of the Third Age, which is a global network of educational groups for retirees and older people. And I've just become the chair of the local branch of that. And obviously I'll be raising environmental awareness and other things through both of those platforms.
And then separately to that, and this is something that I've known about for some time since our CBD days, you have been accumulating a library of open access articles. I think, is it mostly peer-reviewed articles on conservation? Can you just tell the listeners a bit more about that?
Yes. Ever since I did my PhD, I've always been an information junkie. So I've always collected references. And since 2008, I've been building an electronic library, which now has almost 75,000 articles in it, about 50% of which are free and open access. And I'm trying to find a mechanism with the help of the UNDP country offices for making that library available to developing country graduate students so that they would have good access to information on the broader environment and the negative impacts we're having on that broader environment. I think that it's much easier to go to a dedicated library that's been constructed by somebody who's an expert in the field, not to make too proud a claim, than to do a cold Google search. So, for example, in my library just earlier this morning, I filtered for coronavirus and COVID-19, and there are about 500 articles that mention those two words in the title or abstract, which you can add at the click of a finger.
And those are all, you can already be sure that those articles all have something to do with conservation already, right? So you're filtering for COVID and pandemic articles within the conservation literature.
Not necessarily. I throw a broader net for my personal use, but then I can cut down anytime. But one of my roles within the University of the Third Age, which comprises mostly people over the age of 65, going up well into the 80s, is to be very knowledgeable about the impacts of the virus, especially on those vulnerable groups. So it's not just conservation oriented in this particular case.
Yeah, that's actually a nice segue into getting started on the sort of more specific questions. I know that you're not sort of a specific expert on this, but I know how well read you are, and that's why I asked you onto the podcast. Could you explain what is meant by zoonotic disease? And then also, just as a second part to that question, how prominent are zoonotic diseases in the overall scope of human health?
Okay, so zoonotic disease is actually really quite simple. It's any disease or illness of humans, not necessarily humans actually, which originates from another wild or domesticated animal. Over the last 100 years or so, there have been approximately 2 new viruses per year added to the list of zoonotic diseases. But zoonotic disease is not just viruses, it can be bacteria, they can even be small multicellular animals. The largest zoonotic disease organism that I have come across is a tapeworm, for example. Pork tapeworm, which you can catch from pigs, of course, can cause a range of very severe side effects in some cases. And that's also classified as a zoonotic disease. And then it's estimated that about 70% of what are called emerging infectious diseases, so new diseases which are being added to the list, it's estimated that about 70% of those are zoonotic in origin. And that's a list of about 1,500, probably going up towards 2,000 known diseases now.
Including very well-known ones like malaria, for example.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And rabies, toxoplasmosis, which you can get from cats, and a host of others.
Is it usually a case of a wild species passing it on to a domesticated species, livestock or pet species, and then from there to human beings, or is it very often just directly from wild species to human beings?
Yeah, this one is this is a little bit tricky because, I mean, I think you can have all of those. If you look across all of the zoonotic diseases, you'll find many different ways that the disease is transmitted, like malaria through mosquito, for example, and then some from wild species into domestic species into humans. Then we have to remember that domestic species were once wild. When we domesticated them, we could have brought some of those wild diseases into them, and now they act as a domestic reservoir. But the majority of zoonotic diseases tend to have their ultimate reservoir in a wild species, and they either come from the wild species directly to us or through a domesticated species. To give an example, the avian flu, H5N1 avian flu from a few years ago, almost certainly originated in wild ducks somewhere in Southeast Asia, passed probably through domestic ducks mixed with domestic chickens, and eventually spread along the Trans-Siberian Railway with farmers traveling with chickens under their arms. So, it's a complicated web that can be, and that makes identifying some of these diseases and coming up with mechanisms for controlling them quite tricky.
Yeah, and it's all kind of guesswork, just best guesses, right? That's a theory which sort of works and so far hasn't been proven wrong, but it's impossible to prove it exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, for many years, scientists have been studying coronaviruses, and they're fairly confident that the ultimate ecological reservoir for coronaviruses is bats. And bats are quite species rich. They live in communes, and they fly. They're the only mammals that fly. And this very high metabolism that they have when they fly has created a situation where coronaviruses can exist in them, and the immune system of the bats doesn't get rid of them. They tolerate them. And what this has resulted in is like a swarm of coronaviruses. Some scientists estimate that there may be over 2,000 different coronaviruses in bats. And what that means is the coronaviruses themselves are swapping bits of genetic material and constantly creating new viruses. And every so often, one of these evolves a mechanism that enables it to spill over, is the word we use, into a new species. Now, it's thought that this coronavirus has an ecological reservoir in horseshoe bats, and that either through a wet market in China or via a pangolin in a wet market, it transmitted to humans and is able to then spread from human to human, which makes it so difficult and dangerous.
Do you know why they think a pangolin might be involved?
Well, even before the coronavirus and COVID-19 crisis emerged, scientists in China, in fact, in the very city where the outbreak occurred, they were sequencing the genetic material. And then they can compare the genetic sequences from different species, and they can backtrack and find a kind of common ancestor. Now, when they do that, they find a very strong similarity between the coronavirus sequence in the horseshoe bat and parts of the sequence which also occur in the pangolin. So what they think may have happened is that they had a number of coronaviruses jumped across into the pangolin, swapped their genetic material again, and then became able to infect humans. All of the genetic sequence work is to some extent based on probabilities. So you're very unlikely to find the real smoking gun that tells you exactly where the origins. But based on my reading of the literature, the pangolin hypothesis is still the most likely one. Some of the more wacky ideas are that the virus escaped from the lab which is doing the research on coronaviruses. But there's been a very thorough interview with the head of that lab, and she says, they never isolated this particular coronavirus in that lab. There are other theories who say that it's even genetically engineered, that it was manufactured in a laboratory and escaped. But there's sufficient evidence of similarity in wild, free-ranging organisms that's an extremely unlikely hypothesis.
And I guess there will always be, in a case like this, there will always be some conspiracy theories.
Exactly.
Before I ask my sort of central question, I just wanted to mention one other thing, which I think was in an article that you wrote, where you spoke about bats and two other groups of mammals, which are also disproportionately responsible for zoonosis, and those are primates and rodents. And the reasons for those three, bats, primates, and rodents, are completely different.
Of course, the idea doesn't originate with me. It's what I'm extracting from the literature. Bats and rodents are the most species-rich mammals, and they both live fast and furious lives, and they move around quite a lot. As we said, bats fly, rodents disperse and like living close to human populations. So that's kind of reason for those two. Primates are slightly different because, of course, we are primates. And therefore, there's a strong genetic similarity, and that means that a disease that's in a gorilla or a chimpanzee might find it quite easy to spread into a human. And this is probably the case with HIV.
So now that you clarified those few points, something that I keep on reading in articles is that habitat degradation and or deforestation is not just correlated with, but is a cause of zoonosis, and it can lead to pandemics like COVID-19. In the peer-reviewed literature, I don't think I've seen anything that actually suggests that is the direct reason for COVID-19, but they do talk about that being a likely reason and a proven reason for pandemics happening. But what I've noticed is that these articles and these pieces of writing will often start off mentioning that, and then the rest of the conversation will be based on that statement, but without really explaining how or why. So the main thing I wanted to ask you, in the sort of center of this discussion, perhaps, although we'll talk about other things as well, is what is that link?
Okay, I mean, I agree with you that it's very easy to find in the first sentence of lots of articles about the pandemic, that habitat destruction and deforestation in particular are the cause. But let me just talk you through my way of looking at this. It's not so much the habitat destruction, which is the key thing to focus on. It's what we're doing at the interface between human-controlled landscapes and natural or wild landscapes. And in particular, what I think of as the porosity, the permeability of that interface. So imagine if we go back a little bit in time and we have large expanses of intact forests with human indigenous inhabiting those forests, so what I call forest dwellers. They would probably, this is me speculating, they would probably get exposed from time to time to an emerging infectious disease, and it could make them sick, it could kill them, or they could develop some kind of immunity to it. But there's no contact with the rest of the world. Then imagine that as humanity increases in numbers over the time, more and more humans are living close to forests. And most socioeconomic studies that I've read say that if you live within 5 kilometers of a forest margin, you'll probably make use of it through hunting, collecting non-timber forest products, etc. So then again, you have an interface with wildlife, but it's not going very far away. Then the third way I like to think about it is what I call forest invaders. So this is when we go deep into the forest through building a road or mining, and then you cut and you start to fragment the forest, and the interface becomes that much longer and more permeable. If you take a checkerboard analogy of a forest and you remove 50% of the cells, you maximize the interface. And of course, that's what we've been doing to a lot of our forests. It's not just loss of area, it's fragmentation of areas as well. And then, and this is the last of my examples, I have what we call forest movers. So this is when you go into the forest and you take something out and you transport it into the human-dominated landscape. So of course, the wildlife trade is a classic example of that. But there are also examples that are more natural. So say, for example, you fragmented a forest and the bats in that forest no longer have access to enough resources, and they're forced to fly into the human-dominated landscape to forage. So it's not humans moving them, it's humans forcing them to move. And then finally, going back to, let's say we've got a small village somewhere in China where they go into the forest and collect bats for the markets. And maybe third generation still live there, but their son moved to Wuhan and is running a wildlife food stall in Wuhan. And their daughter is now studying at the university in Oxford. And it's Chinese New Year coming up. When everybody moves together, then suddenly what was staying on the forest interface can now be transported anywhere in the world within 24 hours. That, I think, is the key. It's that change in interface and porosity, not just loose habitat degradation.
So I'm fully on board with the idea that the harvesting of wild species is, very obviously something that's going to increase the chances of zoonosis. But you don't need to just destroy habitat to catch bats, right? It's just the extraction of a species. And sort of along with that, someone could make the argument that if you were to, in the case of logging, extracting tree species, that if you were to extract individual trees, without harming the rest of the forest, that would probably be more likely to make transmission happen than the clear felling of an entire forest. So I'm just I guess I just worry a little bit that the idea of pinning the blame might backfire a little bit.
I mean, I agree that there is a possibility of a backlash of using that argument, and it does seem to be happening at the moment in Amazonia, in Brazil, where environmental regulations are being loosened, and both legal and illegal loggers are taking advantage of that and encroaching onto indigenous lands, for example. So I think we do have to be careful, and I think conservationists maybe have not thought carefully enough about jumping on the COVID bandwagon. I think from my point of view, it's a kind of honest mistake to make, because the biodiversity crisis is becoming pretty serious, and conservationists are not clutching at straws, but are willing to take up any argument that they think might help them to make some progress on the issue.
I guess what concerns me most is that the literature is not making the point clearly enough. As I mentioned earlier, many of the articles that I read don't say anything about how this link, or what the link is exactly between habitat degradation and transmission. And then many of the ones that do will cite secondary sources. I saw this again and again. You expect to be able to trace the reference back to the examples, the real life examples, but then you have to go to that just directs you to the next publication, and sometimes the next publication. So perhaps my main concern here is more one of the tightness of the scientific arguments.
A kind of counterexample just came to my mind whilst you were speaking. It's more change and the pace of change than it necessarily being degradation. And I assume you've heard of Lyme disease. Yeah. So on the east coast of the USA, Lyme disease has been increasing, but it's been increasing because of an increase in not forest really, but in woodland and trees close to people living in suburban environments. And that's allowed white-tailed deer and rodents, which act as the vectors for the ticks that eventually bite the humans. So it could be that reforestation leads to an emerging infectious disease. So I think, obviously most of human impact on the environment at the moment is negative from an ecological and increasingly a public health point of view, but not necessarily always.
That reminds me of some of the discussions about buffer zones as well. As something else which has been brought up without very much discussion and explanation is this idea that buffer zones are necessary, between human beings and wildlife, but without really saying what a buffer zone would look like, what that would consist of. So some people might think of those reforested areas as being buffer zones, but what is your sense of what a buffer zone could look like?
I don't think a buffer zone is going to really be like a 10-kilometer strip of uninhabited landscape. I think the way the One Health movement, I can say a little bit more about the One Health movement later, is going, is that scientists are getting to the position where they can almost predict where these highly transparent or highly porous interfaces are. And the buffer would be actually increased monitoring and surveillance of likely emerging infectious diseases. So on the one hand, you have to have intensive study, and there are proposals for billion-dollar world Virome projects that would sequence all known and discover all known viruses. So you build up in advance knowledge of who the likely enemies are. And then you use improved local networks for surveillance. So where you think there's a likely output, you go to those villages and you sample much more quickly, looking for antibodies that indicate that something is likely to be spilling over. So I don't think it needs to be a habitat transformation. It's more a transformation in how we respect nature and the threats that nature is posing for us.
It's an area where a specific kind of effort is focused, right? And that effort is basically monitoring. The effort of monitoring creates a buffer zone out of whatever the habitat might be.
Yes, I mean, for example, there's a project or program that's been running, funded by USAID, called PREDICT, and they actually have been working in 31 countries, including China, where they've been building up this knowledge database of coronaviruses. And in a not very nice twist, when the US president heard about this, he cancelled the PREDICT program, just because it was linked to China. It was a knee-jerk reaction. I'm sure it will come back. And there are, I don't know whether you will have already come across this article, but there is recently, this same group of authors has proposed, a program which would cost billions per year, but they compare that with the trillions that the current COVID-19 virus is causing to the global economy at the moment.
It's still quite a big ask, I would imagine. Billions still sounds like a lot.
You just have to find the right things to compare it to.
Something else I wanted to just touch on is that there is a clearer link between the exploitation of species, and very often threatened species are mentioned, and zoonosis. And you touched on that a few times in the discussion, the extraction of wildlife from habitats, whether or not they are degraded habitats. Do you think that too much is being made of the claim that if we stop harvesting threatened species in particular, we'll reduce the chances of transmission? Because even though many species are threatened, most species are not threatened.
Okay, let me tackle the wildlife trade aspects of this first. I definitely think that there's a strong case for better regulation of both legal and definitely illegal wildlife trade transmission pathways. I don't necessarily think that a ban is the way to go, even though China has gone down that route, at least temporarily. Mm-hmm. Vietnam has been an exceptional case. Until recently, they hadn't had a single death from COVID-19, even though they share a border with China. And I haven't read much about exactly why that is. Partly, it's undoubtedly due to the fact that they did suffer from the SARS epidemic in 2009. So they are better prepared the way other countries like South Korea have been. But I was reading an article a couple of weeks ago that has been looking at coronavirus density numbers, if you like, along the wildlife food trade channels, from hunter to market to restaurant. And what these researchers have found is that the numbers of coronavirus particles detectable increases as you go along the chain. In other words, we're creating the situation for the virus to become more prevalent by crowding together animals, by not looking after them, by stressing them, etc., etc., etc. Now, in Vietnam, bats appear on the menu fairly frequently, and there's also a strong industry collecting guano from bats' caves for use as fertilizer. And I'm just wondering whether, there's a kind of herd immunity to coronaviruses in Vietnam because of exposure to not COVID-19, but to a sufficiently large number of similar coronaviruses to give them some sort of immunity.
And that's sorry to interrupt, but that bats on the menu, is that's something that's been around for a long time, presumably, in order to support that theory. I guess it would have to have been something that's cultural and historical.
Now, coming back to the threatened part of what you were saying, I agree with you that the majority of species that are on the menu in those wet markets are probably not seriously endangered. I think possibly the connection has become too strong because we're dealing with pangolins as a possible intermediate vector. And pangolins are, of course, extremely threatened at the moment. But I was struggling to think of another seriously endangered species, off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess there are some where they become, like pangolins, extremely prestigious items on menus and banquets and so on.
Yeah, I guess I just worry a little bit that sort of pinning our hopes on a particular statement like that can backfire a little bit.
Yes, I mean, Elizabeth Moreno, the executive secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, was very careful to say that wildlife markets need to be regulated, not banned, because too many people are still dependent upon wild food, both in Asia and in Africa and in South America, of course.
And apart from that, of course, the informal markets would simply boom. So if you were suddenly asked to be advisor to the government of, for example, China or Vietnam, and asked for your opinion on regulation, what would you say? You mentioned that an outright ban probably wouldn't be appropriate, and I guess what you mean is that it wouldn't be effective, right? It wouldn't be the most effective way of doing things, and also, as you mentioned now, it would have probably quite severe consequences for communities.
Yeah, well, I think clearly, improving the regulation by making sure that all of the markets are fully licensed and all of the traders within them are fully licensed. Improvements in animal care and hygiene, regular monitoring of both food and personnel, and as I say, linking that to working your way up the transmission lines to the hotspots of spillover.
Right. But then the thing is that those those all sound like very good proposals, but none of those would necessarily do anything to reduce the number of species, including threatened species, that are being taken from the wild, right? So I'm just wondering, like, how do you link regulations to conservation in a case like that?
Well, if I'm right that there are only a few seriously endangered species, then the things that I was proposing would stabilize the wildlife trade market, because you should be able to calculate, what a sustainable harvest of those particular species would be if you make sure that different species are being traded in different parts of the market, so that they're not coming into combination and being allowed to exchange diseased material. And then you would have to introduce specific measures for more endangered species. And I believe it was you who suggested in one of our previous discussions that this could maybe be done better under the CITES, Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species, to introduce some sort of the disease, public health or human health component to the way species are added to the list, and allow countries to better monitor and license their international movements, although that wouldn't help with domestic movements, of course.
And I guess also just the way that the cookie has crumbled in this particular case, there is strong evidence that pangolins may be involved, and therefore suggestions, I guess, that could be made for regulation. I heard at an earlier stage, that the Chinese government were, I don't know exactly how they decided on a species being threatened or not. I don't know if they were using IUCN's guidelines, but basically, if a species was threatened, people were not allowed to trade it for food, but they were allowed to trade it medicinally. And in the case of pangolin, that meant that they were being traded in fairly large numbers.
I know that immediately at the beginning of the year, they imposed a total ban on the wildlife food trade markets. And they were preparing legislation, and there were rumors that the legislation was going to be a full ban. But since then, I don't think the legislation has been promulgated. And I think the government of China is probably reviewing the situation and having a second think about exactly what they want to do. I don't know if they use the IUCN criteria classifications. I suspect they do. But most of the red listing is done at an international level, and then not every country necessarily comes up with a national red list. Although I suspect China does have one.
Hi, I'm just stepping in here to let you know that this is the point at which we changed the course of the conversation back to what we've been discussing earlier. The statement would be something to the effect of habitat degradation is a cause of increased transmission of zoonotic disease. And then in some cases, there's no reference to that. It's just a statement. So, you just have to take their word for it. In other cases, they'll put a reference or two in brackets. If you then go and have a look at those references that they've cited, those references will do the same thing. They'll make the same kind of statement. Habitat degradation is the cause of increased zoonotic disease transmission, and then they'll give another reference. And then you have to go to that one to find out what the study was that came up with that information. And my understanding was that you should really be citing the publication which did the research to come to that conclusion. So, and which are usually kind of fairly local level studies, right? It's usually sort of within a particular country or a particular area, and then that's one bit of data that goes towards coming up with a conclusion like that. Or do you think that is just such an obvious conclusion, an obvious statement to make, that you really don't need to back it up with a bunch of references?
As we discovered through the conversation, I'm a bit more comfortable with statements that say that emerging infectious diseases are the result of habitat degradation, because I see fragmentation and things like that as degradation. So it doesn't cause me sleepless nights, really. And I think what you put your finger on in terms of the referencing is the fact that we're sitting on an exponentially increasing pile of research literature. Going back to the library I'm trying to build, every day is like running on a treadmill for me, just to kind of keep up for it. And I think this inevitably leads to people not being able to backtrack and cite the original researches. I mean, I like to think I'm quite good. I read an article and then I read the bibliography and then I go and find, some of the references. It sounds like you've been doing the same. But increasingly, when you've got research tenure track type people trying to get as many publications as possible, I think we've let quality slip a little bit there. And when you superimpose on that an additional literature of newspaper journalism, magazine journalism, where environment is increasingly being covered, then I think it becomes quite difficult to maintain those high standards that you're looking for.
And just with COVID-19 articles in particular, it's incredible, isn't it? It's just hundreds and probably thousands of articles a day that are being produced.
Not guaranteed. Yeah. I mean, I saw a number, I think 20,000, or might even have been 200,000. I mean, it's just crazy. It's very, very difficult for most people to sort of backtrack to that original reference. And I do think, if we concentrate more on the border between a human influenced and a natural or more natural landscape, and use words like spillover, we more accurately explain the relationship. You don't necessarily have to have anything change in the remaining forest. You just make it leaky.
Yeah, and logging roads in particular have been implicated as quite a clear example of that. They don't necessarily take up very much space themselves even, but they provide access to much deeper and less explored parts of the forest in this case.
Yeah, I mean, the classic example is transboundary roads in the Amazon. With the military government historically in Brazil, wanted to open up the Amazon by building roads, to get control of it, because it was considered, to be a jungle and a barrier to development. And then the famous Trans-Amazonian highway was right across it, but it degraded so quickly. It was a tarmac road originally, and it degraded so quickly it became unusable. And now President Bolsonaro is threatening or planning to repave it.
So if, let's say, you have a block of forest and you vastly increase the porosity by building logging roads and whatever else, fragmenting the habitat, doesn't that mean that there will be an increased contact between a very limited number of people, a limited group of people, and the forest? And those people are the loggers and possibly the farmers who would sort of move in there and use the cleared land for agriculture, or the hunters. But isn't it a very small number of people that would actually be exposed to those? Or I suppose your counter argument would be that you only need one person to transmit the virus, right?
No, statistically you need more than one, I think. But no, this is where the second thing comes in, that is this massive interconnectivity and speed of transmission beyond that 5 kilometer section of people who interface with the edge of the forest, or loggers who move in and out. The most heavily impacted countries with COVID in the early outbreak were all owners of one of the top 20 airports in the world, the top 20 busiest airports in the world. We here in England, we got the virus from half a dozen different countries. And it's that, the fact, the analogy that I used, that Granny could be living in that 5 kilometer zone next to the edge of the forest. Her son could be working in a big city in the wildlife food market, and his daughter could be studying in the University of Oxford. And they may all have met up for Chinese New Year. That's all we need.
But then let's think of two models. So model A is that there's no habitat degradation, but people are going into the forest and extracting wildlife for consumption and medicine and all the rest of it. And then model B is severe habitat degradation and fragmentation, and also people taking wildlife from the forest for the same reasons. Now, I guess my question is, why would the one be worse than the other one? Is it simply because in case B, they're able to harvest more wildlife because of access to the forest, or is it more than that?
I wouldn't draw such a big distinction between the two. I think both are perfectly possible mechanisms, and I wouldn't say one is necessarily that much greater than the other. And I think there's a third one, that if you degrade a forest and force those forest dwelling species to move out, we haven't done anything except degrade the forest, but they've increased the porosity.
Mm-hmm. Right.
As to how many emerging infectious diseases have gone down each of those three pathways, I couldn't put a number on it.
Just to kind of, again, be devil's advocate, you said that between A and B, there's not necessarily so much of a difference, but the difference is that there's no habitat destruction or habitat degradation in A, but there is habitat degradation in B. So if there's no difference between them, then aren't you saying that habitat degradation is not increasing the chance of transmission?
I think maybe we've got a temporal misunderstanding here.
Uh-huh.
If you've got a Chinese village on the edge of a forest, then they have degraded the forest because they've been moving the agricultural frontier. It's not so much the degradation of the forest that's left, it's the fact that the forest has gone.
Mm-hmm.
That I think is what people are referring to when they loosely talk about forest degradation.
Mm.
Not the condition of the remaining forest, but the fact that the agricultural frontier has moved through the forest. People don't realise that we've, totally transformed, something like 2/3 of the global landscape. That is all degraded, well, not all degraded forests, but that's an awful lot of degraded forests. And it means that humans that are right up against the interface with wildlife much more than we ever were historically. This speed of movement thing is also very important. I think it's underplayed because it's an inconvenient truth. But the previous Spanish flu pandemic came when troops were moving all around the world because of the World War I. That was the closest we've ever been to the level of mobility that we take for granted in this century. And I think that's as big a contributor to the pandemic component as opposed to disease and epidemic as the initial spillover. And if we go back to flying without checks and things the way we did before the pandemic, we'll get more of the same.
Okay, that wraps up episode 2. Head over to the episode notes or the website if you'd like to look up further resources linked to this topic. There's a lot available, so David and I tried to select some of the more useful and interesting information to make it a bit easier. Next time, I'll be speaking to Mao Amis about how we could be doing conservation better in developing countries. Mao is founding director of the African Center for a Green Economy, and he has worked on various initiatives around Africa, which will be the geographical focus of this episode. I do hope that you can join us again for this important discussion.